shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Today, rather good evening.
The world in the mid-80s is girdled by pictures, showering down from more than 60 satellites. Television for hundreds of millions of viewers. And today, a whole new generation of television satellites is about to lift off as the opening salvo in a global television revolution. The new race for television is about to begin. Only 60 years ago, the first race for television had a less spectacular beginning. This is one of the first surviving television images. The year is 1928. Just 8 years later, the race for television was won and lost by the man who led the way and recorded this picture.
The station goes on the air.
November the 2nd, 1936, the world's first modern television broadcast. This is the opening of BBC TV, the first regular public television service on Earth with high-definition pictures and a schedule of programs, 2 hours a day, 6 days a week. Only about 2,000 viewers saw this opening broadcast, but it signaled the end of an extraordinary international race for television that obsessed a handful of pioneers from Tokyo to Berlin and from San Francisco and Leningrad to London. This program is the story of that race. From the beginning, television begins to establish the patterns of power familiar today. A power which drew from John Reith, the BBC's first Director General, the prediction that TV might soon become a social menace of the first magnitude.
Wonderful thing, television.
Television was born to a tiny audience. But it was from the very beginning a surprisingly vigorous infant. Long before television became a reality, it was established as a tantalizing idea. For the most part, it remained the territory of cartoonists with a taste for entertaining prophecy. A century ago, the French artist Logie Baird scored a striking number of hits. a woman undresses on the screen. Television will provide education. It will also provoke sex and violence. And it will bring to our homes the horror of war. But television soon became more than a topic for futuristic cartoons. In the race which was about to begin, many contenders have their champions today.
Baird definitely was the very first to successfully demonstrate television.
And he said very quietly to me, "I've come to tell you that I have achieved television."
Electronic TV was first invented by our own countryman, Professor Boris Leibovich Rosing, in 1907.
Germany was, in fact, the first country to begin an expanded service.
The idea was that we were trying to beat the British to get a continuing service of television on the air.
At that moment, I was very, very happy, and I said to myself, now for the very first time, we have the basis of television.
And all these great minds were working night and day. It was a kind of an international race.
Which of these men was to win that race to invent television is still a matter of debate and national pride. But already, 100 years ago, the race was on. From the 1880s, a series of pioneering inventions and experiments in Russia, Germany, America, France, and the United Kingdom opened the way for television. More than 50 serious proposals for distance seeing were documented by the 1920s. But already, a fundamental division had emerged between two methods for making television pictures, which was to split the contenders in the race for TV and fuel some of its most bitter arguments. Some pioneers insisted that television would have to be electronic and based on the recently invented cathode ray tube. Others were equally committed to the idea of mechanical television. This is the heart of mechanical TV, the Nipkow disc. Spinning at high speed inside the TV camera and also in the home receiver, its basic limitations and crude pictures were to prove disastrous for its supporters. By the early 1920s, the contenders in the television race were working in at least half a dozen centers around the world, in Europe, America, the Soviet Union, and Japan. In Britain, television had attracted an improbable enthusiast with a talent for showmanship.
We introduce Mr. John Baird, the inventor.
This is the scanning disc with its lenses. This is the second disc by which the light is further divided and passes into the light cell.
John Logie Baird was a restless, charming Scotsman who'd already shrugged off several careers by the time he began to experiment with television in the early 1920s at the age of 34. The inventor of the Baird undersock, the entrepreneur who had dabbled with chutney in the West Indies, artificial diamonds in Glasgow, and soap in London, turned his unusual energies to seeing by wireless in 1923, as he announced in the Times personal column. From the start, Baird was totally committed to the idea of mechanical television and dismissed the electronic system. It was to prove ultimately a disastrous decision. In Britain, the race for television began unpromisingly here in Hastings in February 1923. For radio dealer Victor Mills, it began with a knock on his door from a strange Scotsman.
He was dressed in an old raincoat. Certainly didn't look as though he'd owned anything. And he said, I fitted up an apparatus for transmitting pictures, television. And he says, I can't get it to go. Well, I'd arranged to go and see him, so I went down there. The workshop proper didn't exist. He had a collection of junk. That's what he boils down to. Now, quite truly, I wouldn't have given £2 for the lot.
The creator of the junk was John Logie Baird. Wood from coffins, darning needles, hat boxes, sealing wax, and a cycle lamp lens joined a spinning disc cut from an old tea chest. But for all the laughable crudeness of the equipment, Victor Mills was about to share with Baird in a historic moment.
And I put my hand in front of the neon, just a flick. But in the meantime, Baird yelled out, "It's here, it's here."
This image, reconstructed here, was the first time anyone had achieved an instantaneous moving picture anywhere in the world. Characteristically, Baird speedily began to give demonstrations to the press. But equally characteristically, he was thrown out of his rooms in Hastings for causing explosions. He soon moved to London, where he continued his experiments in Soho and employed his charm to try to raise money and support. Desperately hard up, he looked for sponsors. By March 1925, Baird found an improbable partner in Selfridge's department store, who were looking for a gimmick to attract customers. Among the crowd was a schoolgirl, Elizabeth Wood.
And then Mr. Baird came in. He really gave us a demonstration of all the apparatus and told us how it happened. And then it came on, and it was a little disappointing, really, because there were black lines sort of wiggling across it, and it jumped up and down. And then we all clapped rather politely, because we were all at the front of the television. I think the trouble was that we believed that if they could make this film, they could see into our houses. We could see them, they could see us.
Baird reports how at this time in his Soho laboratory, he had little money for equipment, less for food, and none at all for clothes. But his experiments prospered. He transmitted across a room a cardboard face with a winking eye. And since the scorching heat of his lights and the rigidity he needed from his models was too much for a human sitter, he used a ventriloquist dummy called Stookie. By the autumn of 1926, his original one-yard transmission in Hastings had stretched to 8 miles, and Baird had scraped together his own company, Television Limited. But in the international race for television, other contenders were also making progress. In Japan, by 1926, a young engineer was experimenting with electronic television. Kenshiro Takayanagi recalls how he was very conscious of the race.
I thought, I'm also doing serious research into television, and I must never let the other countries beat me. I have to get something done very quickly. I decided that to begin with, I would try to transmit the Japanese letter E. And very soon, a really good image appeared, and I knew that I was able to show the character E on my screen.
In the Soviet Union, the race for television was also making progress in the late 1920s. Alongside the massive social upheaval in the years following the revolution, Soviet scientists quickly solved the basic problems of producing television pictures.
This, in essence, is the first television picture obtained by us as long ago as 1928.
While an experimental studio was set up in Leningrad working with mechanical TV, major developments in electronic television were being made in Tashkent as early as 1926. For the time being, radio was the new popular miracle, while some Soviet scientists had left revolutionary Russia to continue the television race in the West. In America, Vladimir Zworykin, one of the emigre pioneers from the Soviet Union committed to electronic television, found his new ideas weren't immediately popular in the early 20s with his American boss at the Westinghouse Company.
He wasn't very impressed. So finally he asked me a few questions, mostly how long did I work with this system and so on, and departed, saying a few words to the director of the laboratory. Later on, I found out that what he said was, put his guy to work on something more useful.
Zworykin soon went to work for the huge and powerful RCA company and its boss, another Russian emigre, David Sarnoff. America's crucial link between big business and television was quickly forged. Sarnoff, a pioneer of radio in America, was already delivering visionary pronouncements about TV's potential. He announced, "The whole country will join in every national procession." He also predicted that television would transform human relations. But Sarnoff had already seen the work of a serious rival, a young American who was to be his bitter opponent in the race for TV over the next decade. Today, 200 Green Street, San Francisco, is a historic monument. Elmer Farnsworth remembers how it was almost 60 years ago when her late husband pioneered electronic television here. It was 1927, and Philo T. Farnsworth was just 20. His widow also recalls his dedication to television revealed on their wedding night.
He said, "You know, there's another woman in my life." And I said, well, I didn't say anything. I was dumbstruck. And he said, "Well, her name is television. And in order to have enough time together, I want you to work with me." And he said, "We're going to be working right on the edge of discovery, and it's going to be very exciting, and I want you to be part of it."
Television is about to emerge from the laboratory to bring into your home news, entertainment, and material of educational value.
RCA soon tried to buy out Farnsworth. He flatly refused. But his first demonstration to his sponsors in May 1928 suggested Farnsworth's problems. One of his backers was a banker called Daddy Fagan.
Mr. Fagan called out and he said, "When are we going to see some dollars in this thing, Farnsworth?" And immediately a dollar sign appeared on the screen.
Meanwhile, back in London, Baird was still developing his mechanical TV. It was still cumbersome and noisy, and he was still in money trouble. By 1928, Baird televisors were being advertised for between £20 and £150. But most enthusiasts bought his kits for just 16 guineas. It was time for a bold gimmick.
It is interesting to note that as far back as 1928, I spanned the Atlantic with television.
In an attempt to raise publicity and sales, Baird succeeded in February 1928 in sending a television picture from London to New York. Shares in Baird's company boomed. On the way home, he pulled off another successful stunt when his team set up their equipment aboard the SS Berengaria in mid-Atlantic and invited the ship's wireless operator to view his fiancée in the Baird London studio. The press were ecstatic, headlining "Lovers Meet by Television." But there was little comment about the fact that the operator had difficulty in recognizing his fiancée. The low frequencies used for TV at the time allowed the pictures to travel much greater distances than today. But the images produced by mechanical TV remained very crude for all Baird's energies.
Logie Baird's enthusiasm was so catching. We would work for hours because he would be there and he'd say, "I've nearly got it, I've nearly got it." And we were rooting for him, you know, we wanted him to get it right. Yes, I think that we all saw that it was going to be something very big. We didn't know how.
There was no doubt that Baird's showmanship was making people aware of the new medium. A Heath Robinson cartoon of March 1928 speculated about some new uses for television.
For the toilet, enabling the televisioner to see the back of his head when brushing his hair. For the convenience of the angler, permitting him to keep his eye on the bait without undue exertion. A handy set for schoolmasters, enabling them, while enjoying their midday solace in quiet, to keep an eye on their pupils. A gentleman locating a missing stud with the aid of a neat dressing room television set.
By the late 1920s, America was becoming a serious contender in the race. Pioneers offered some striking public demonstrations.
now show you the first motion picture record of a television image.
This picture was recorded and synchronized with sound in the General Electric Company's House of Magic at Schenectady, New York.
Despite his flair for showmanship, there were worrying indications for Baird that he had serious rivals.
Since most people have heard a great deal about television,
by the late 20s, there were 18 licensed visual broadcasting stations in the USA transmitting faces and silhouettes. Excited crowds turned up at public demonstrations. Americans had produced the first TV play and the first outside broadcast. Television experiments would soon be progressing rapidly here in France, as well as in Germany and the Soviet Union. Baird began what was to be a long and often bitter campaign to get the BBC to transmit his television. But unrecognized by Baird, and most threatening of all to his ambition to win the race, experiments in electronic television were showing great promise. In Britain, Baird's electronic rival was to be the EMI company, a well-organized group with links both to Marconi and RCA in America. At the EMI laboratories in Middlesex, the company also had the expertise of yet another brilliant émigré Russian, Isaac Schoenberg, who would soon be making great progress with electronic TV. One of EMI's engineers, Bernard Greenhead, recalls an early demonstration.
Everybody seemed to be particularly pleased, and I think we were very pleased ourselves that there hadn't been any breakdowns. The equipment hadn't coughed at any time. And after the visitors had gone, Schoenberg came back into the control room and he said, "Well, gentlemen, you seemed to have perfected the biggest time waster of all mankind. I hope you use it well."
Now tell me, sir, whether with this flower in my mouth I can sit quietly at home as this woman would have me do.
July 1930. At last, John Logie Baird had won a temporary victory in his battle to transmit experimental television on the BBC using his still primitive 30-line mechanical system. This is an exact reconstruction via a Baird receiver of the first play on British television, Pirandello's The Man with a Flower in His Mouth, broadcast 55 years ago.
I must go out and look.
Of course, they had to adapt themselves most ingeniously to our very tiny area of operation, head and shoulder views of people. Movement of artists in and out of the picture was very carefully and gently done. If we wanted to change of scene, you had to very carefully slide in a thing looking like a draft board, which was slid in slowly in front of the artist, and then while that was there occupying the screen, the artist would get out of the chair and the other one would get in.
I was only joking. Well, I must be going. The very worst I might do is to kill myself.
It was the miracle of television that appealed to people at the very beginning. The fact that you could see anything at all. The subject matter hardly mattered, hardly concerned them. It was just seeing something. Almost in those very early days, when radio had only been going 6 years, 7 years, even listening was a thrill to many people who'd made their own sets and so on. And the same with television. The people who saw it at the beginning were almost only those who'd made their own sets.
With Baird himself estimating that there were only 29 sets in Britain by the late 20s, advertising had plenty of scope. Sets were still as expensive as a car, and only the skillful fanatic would relish the joys of building his own television. But pursuing his publicity efforts, Baird sent one of his sets to Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, who hailed it as a wonderful miracle. And Baird got more headlines in June 1931 by televising the Derby as a demonstration, though the pictures must have frustrated viewing punters.
And all that we ever expected or could see were the horses just flashing past the winning post. And that was all rather fascinating. You wouldn't be able to tell one horse from another or one jockey from another, but you could at least tell they were horses.
In the international TV race, the Soviet Union was still a leading contender, beginning experimental television to a tiny audience in October 1934.
When everything was ready, you heard, "Attention,
Attention, attention, comrades, radio viewers. Note that, radio viewers. Watch, listen to the first television concert. And the radio viewers didn't have such a set. They didn't know what was going on. They tried to see something. They looked into the loudspeaker, and of course, they could see nothing. And our magazine's editorial received a flood of letters. Tell us where we should look. America in the early 30s had fallen behind in the race. In his experimental studios, Philo Farnsworth continued his electronic pioneering. But after an initial boom, America's fledgling TV industry faded because of commercial rivalries and because the pictures were too poor to attract advertising sponsorship. In the mid-30s, a fierce legal battle over patents developed between Sarnoff's RCA and Philo Farnsworth, which was to drag on for years, leaving American television in a state of suspended animation. Sarnoff still made astute prophecies about the potential power of TV. Showmanship in presenting political appeal will be more effective than mere skill in talking, he wrote. But he also urged advertisers will be given new possibilities.
Technicians in the Farnsworth Philadelphia laboratories have helped to make television, the dazzling dream of the decade, a practical reality today.
For the time being, television in the USA withdrew to the laboratories, where important developments were being made in electronic TV in great secrecy, heavily funded by companies like Farnsworth's rival RCA, who was still determined to win the race for television.
We didn't want anybody to know how well we were doing. It was sort of like a spy. Anybody would give it away, the British would know and would beat us. So that was the whole purpose of that early secrecy, just to make sure that we were first.
From August 1932, Baird had begun a regular 4-day-a-week experimental service via BBC transmitters. But the BBC became increasingly uneasy with the crude pictures as trials of the rival electronic television became more impressive. Meanwhile, if television was a problem for the engineers, it was also a trial for artists appearing on television at this period. Makeup could be a particularly messy business. In addition to all this, TV performers in mechanical TV studios often had to work in total darkness and very restricted space, scanned by a brilliant beam of light.
We had makeup on me, put makeup on me with black lipstick. I looked like Pola Negri or Garbo years ago in silent pictures.
Dancers Vera McConaughey and Gelda Waller had first-hand experience of those early years and braved the hazards of the makeup routine in the Baird experimental studios.
Polish. Yes, dreadful. Royal blue noses at the side of the nose, and royal blue lips, and something on the cheek, I think.
There's green, I think. And I went to a weird little studio with black and white squares on the floor, and black and white squares on the wall, and blinding lights, and a queer makeup with blue lips, and I was going out on a date, and that was most annoying.
And we looked like puddings when we looked at each other, didn't we?
Yeah, quite
frightening.
Very
frightening indeed. It was horrible.
And they wanted the Mexican hat dance. So I had the hat there, and I had to do it on my toes, whether I liked it or not. And, of course, I had to have music.
By 1934, Baird's commercial backers insisted that he should take notice of the rapid developments in the rival electronic television, as demonstrated in America in Farnsworth's experimental studios. On a visit to Britain, partly to raise money for his legal battles with RCA, Farnsworth arranged a demonstration of his system for Baird.
Mr. Baird was extolling his method of television, and he thought that it was better than Phil's and all this. And he got to the door of this room, and he got a sight of the screen, and he became still. He carefully and slowly advanced to it like one mesmerized until he stood right in front of it and stood there for quite some minutes. And then he just turned and left without a word. And Phil felt very badly for him because he knew that he was hearing the death knell of his pet method of television.
Baird's sponsors paid Farnsworth $50,000 to supply the Scotsman with electronic components to boost his troubled mechanical TV. But Baird remained reluctant to give up his system. By the mid-30s, Germany was a leading contender in the TV race, with a regular service of low-definition pictures opening in 1935. Despite Dr. Goebbels' appearance at a Berlin TV exhibition that year, surprisingly, the Nazis did not directly exploit television's propaganda potential. Hitler never spoke on TV, and the service mainly transmitted novelties to a tiny handful of public sets in Berlin.
What the British were intending to do at the end of 35, we could do well beforehand, that very day even. And so, on March 22nd, 1935, from one day to the next, the first TV service in the world began.
Britain has always been reluctant to see this system, born in Nazi Germany, as a winner of the race for TV. The 180-line pictures were much cruder than the 405-line service the BBC would open within months. But certainly in the studio of the Berlin Post Office, Ursula Patschke became a candidate for the first TV announcer.
7,2 Meter für Bild und auf Welle 7,06 Meter für Ton. Ich besaß einen Hund.
I had a dog who always went with me. Time would drag, but what else was I supposed to show? I left my seat, got the dog to jump up into it, made him sit up and beg, told him to say woof, and then he said woof, of course. People were intrigued.
In Berlin before the war, when I was Daily Telegraph correspondent, there was a video telephone service opened between Berlin and Leipzig. I think it was on March 1st, 1936.
Hallo? Tag Helga. Na siehst du, da bin ich selbst. Na wunderbar.
And now the German press is writing as if a new service, which is just about to start, was the first ever.
Within months, the new German TV service boldly televised the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games, though the audience was still tiny and largely restricted to viewing rooms in Berlin and Hamburg. The cameraman working with the newly developed equipment was Walter Bruch.
The place where the camera stood was exactly the finishing line, over there, of the 100-meter sprint. We were therefore able to broadcast how Jesse Owens won the gold medal at the time. So it was a wonderful and unforgettable experience for me. I'm not an athlete, and I saw all that through the camera. And I had, you could say, a better place down there than Hitler.
The final lap of the race for television was to be fought out in Britain, between Baird and his rival, EMI. In September 1935, after 1,500 programs, Baird's experimental transmission was finally closed down by the BBC. A government report recommended a final and decisive competition between Baird's mechanical television and the Marconi EMI electronic system in a 6-month trial. A studio took shape at Alexandra Palace, 12 miles north of London, aiming for a start date in November 1936. But in a last-minute attempt to boost sales at the Radio Olympia exhibition in August, transmissions began with the manicured voice of Elizabeth Cowell.
Hello, Radio Olympia. This is direct television from the studios at the Alexandra Palace. And now you're going to see and hear someone you know well, Miss Helen Mackay.
The British press was suddenly excited about television and suspicious. Can television see into your home? Asked the Daily Express. Will television sterilize the population? The Daily Telegraph suggested some exotic names for television viewers. Teleseer, Televis, Ord Observer, Ordovis, Invider, Telegazer, Visioneer, Beholder, Opticarius, Ingazer, and Bairder. Viewer was rejected. 3 months later, on November the 2nd, 1936, the BBC opened the world's first high-definition television service with another song, Adele Dixon's Magic Rays of Light. The Times wrote, "The moment long seen afar off by eyes of faith has come at last." But the final sprint in the race for television was still to be won, and the signs didn't look good for Baird at the opening ceremony.
He came to Alexandra Palace that day, but apparently nobody thought that he should be invited. It was thought only important executives and government people should take part. And the poor man was left wandering up and down the passage, waiting to be invited, and never was. Wasn't that sad?
From the start, Studio A at Alexandra Palace used the EMI electronic system. Studio B was fitted up with a new and desperate variation of Baird's mechanical system. In the new Baird system, a film camera recorded each picture, and the exposed film was immediately processed in a tank. The film, still wet, was scanned by a rotating disc, changing the pictures to electric impulses, which were then magnified for television transmission. Baird had incorporated some of the electronic elements supplied from America by Farnsworth, but refused to give up his mechanical disc. The pictures were usually good, but the machine was very noisy and massively inflexible. Worst of all, it regularly broke down. The man responsible for organizing the new BBC service was Cecil Madden. His budget for the entire opening week was £1,000.
So in the first week we were able to say that we'd done a play, a ballet and an opera, 2 editions of Picture Page, a variety show on the Saturday night, and a good many items all round in between. So we opened really pretty big.
And as I drove in and out from Alexandra Palace, every day one used to look for the television area on somebody's house and say, there's one. And 5 miles later you'd say, there's a new one. We're getting viewers at last.
Picture Page, the first British magazine program, was introduced by the switchboard girl, Joan Miller. She recalls the hazards of the final TV race.
And very, very often indeed, the camera on perhaps the victim who was being interviewed at the time broke down, whereupon you would see the boys all clustering around, taking her down, and then you would suddenly see my camera coming, rushing up to me, and they, upstairs, I would hear the boys, "Joan, the camera's gone, start talking."
The main interviewer on Picture Page was ex-radio announcer Leslie Mitchell. His screen career began with a shock.
I went into my office one morning and my secretary was there in a great state of dinner with the front page of the Daily Mail and held it up and said, "Look at this," and said above it, "Television Adonis found," on the BBC staff all the time. It was me. We were prepared to do anything, though, in those days, and we tried our damnedest.
Here's Leslie Mitchell, almost a fireman. His nibs hangs heroically to the top of a ladder.
And then on another occasion, the fire brigade did another show in which Jasmine Bligh was supposed to have found herself enveloped in flames and stood on the ledge outside her window while they sent up a gallant gentleman to rescue her and carry her down. She was no small weight. Anyway, she got down safely, and all was well.
Saved. Hoorah!
At the beginning of 1937, the weekly battle between the hard-pressed system of John Logie Baird And the more sophisticated electronic studio of EMI and Marconi was reaching a crisis.
The things in Marconi EMI were very easy and smooth, and it all worked perfectly. But in the Baird studio, there were complications. The thing often broke down, bubbles appeared on the films, and quite frankly, the artists just didn't want to appear on it. Quite important people came and practically prayed at my desk, saying, "Don't put us on in the Baird week." So I think the finger of doom was on it.
In February 1937, John Logie Baird was finished. The decision was made to drop his system, and EMI was declared the winner. After 15 years of pioneering effort, Baird's race was over. His rivals in the race for television acknowledged his contribution.
John Logie Baird was, I believe, an excellent propagandist for television. He was thoroughly convinced, I'm sure, that television was the thing of the future.
It was the richest person who won. In other words, EMI won. And it was from that moment on that Baird was on the sidelines. And for my part, I understand the pain and sorrow he must have felt to have failed in this way. And in reality, television owes much more to Baird than it does to EMI.
For the new BBC channel, there was an early challenge in the spring of 1937 with the coronation of King George VI. It was television's first big occasion, watched by thousands.
I really did think we were really breaking new ground, that this was showing the great possibilities of television, because seeing something while it was happening, some event while it was happening, was always thought in our minds at that time, and I think in public minds too, as the real job of television. It was always proclaimed by Baird and others that soon you'll be sitting in your home seeing the derby and events in all parts of the world coming live to you, sitting in your armchairs, that kind of thing, you see. And this is what we thought in those days, really was what television was for.
By the late 30s, television services were springing up across Europe. But they were still broadcasting to tiny audiences. In France, by 1938, there were still only 400 sets. In Germany, an accomplished and ambitious service was televising to just 11 public viewing rooms. And in the Soviet Union, where a TV receiver still cost as much as a car, there were only a few hundred sets by the late 30s. In America, after the years of experimentation and commercial wrangling, television was at last poised for a major launch in 1939. The New York World's Fair, opened by President Roosevelt on April the 30th, was to be the curtain raiser. Prophetically, the opening ceremony was staged especially for TV. It was televised by David Sarnoff's National Broadcasting Company to an audience of about 1,000 people.
I hereby dedicate the World's Fair, the New York World's Fair of 1939, and I declare it open to all mankind.
David Sarnoff used the World's Fair to announce a new era of commercial television. The next day, RCA offered 25 different models of TV sets for sale. But once again, the plans for television in America were halted by suspicious authorities. In Britain, after almost 3 years of BBC television, with an audience now approaching 100,000, the first era of TV was almost at an end.
And then, of course, the famous day came. I think it was September the 1st, 1939, when it was decided from Broadcasting House that television must stop And so a message was simply given to the engineers at Alexandra Palace, switch off everything, it's over. And it just so happened that it was in the middle of a film. It was a film I think is called Mickey's Hollywood Premiere or something like that.
Congratulations, Mr. Mickey Mouse. Congratulations, it's a gift, and we want to shake your hand. Congratulations, and we hope to have...
And halfway through, if you please, they hadn't even the courtesy or the taste to let us finish the film. They just cut it off like that.
I think I can meet you now.
And the screen went blank. And that was the end of television for the war, because there was a fear that enemy bombers could zoom in on the aerial, which was a wonderful guide to London.
They've made several successful hits on tanks.
Television went to war. In Britain, the war effort absorbed trained television technicians into the country's radar network. Television cameras installed in bombers reported on bomb damage. But some witnesses suggest a closer connection between national defense and Britain's pioneering television service.
About after a year, I ran into Lord Swinton, who had been the Air Minister. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I've been radar for the last few years." And he said, and before, I said, "I was television." And he said, "Well, do you realize that actually Britain started public service television because we had invented radar, we knew a war was likely to come, and we wouldn't have had the production facilities to manufacture the cathode ray tubes if we hadn't had public service television going. And we got it on the air in time, so that the moment war started, not only could we use the engineers, but it would use the production facilities to manufacture the radar for the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, which helped us win the Battle of Britain.
In the Soviet Union and America, the war wiped television off the screens. But in Nazi-occupied Europe, it was a different story. Suspended briefly during the invasion of Poland, German television continued for another 4 years. While television continued to entertain the troops, the Nazi government planned the production of 5,000 home receivers after the war was won. Occupied Paris in 1940. Hitler's army was followed by German television, and the station manager was sent from Berlin to take charge.
At that time, in Paris, all the hospitals whose patients included German soldiers could watch us. Suitable receivers had been set up everywhere. In Paris, we had the biggest television studio in the world and the world's most powerful transmitter. It couldn't have been better.
TV culture for the Wehrmacht, a ballet by the director of the Paris Opera House. But on the other side of the channel, as the war drew to a close, BBC television was preparing for a comeback.
I want you back most of the time for a postcard effect, unless I ask you to go into a close-up. Number 3 on the low tripod, down for the stunt shots. And number 2, you start on the caption, keep screwed up high, and after the first caption, turn and dolly onto the set.
And it was all kept terribly secret that the studios had been reopened. And so I got hold of the Windmill Girls, who never let anyone down. And they came with all their dresses and things like that, and soon settled down.
The Windmill Girls program was, in fact, a closed-circuit test, not seen by the viewing public. But soon, British television was to be back on the screen.
It was all done very quickly, and really it was so extraordinary to be doing television in the war after all those years of Bleak and Blitz and V1s and V2s and all the disasters we'd had It was in February 1945, which was before VE Day or VJ Day. So it was television in the war, and that hasn't really been known to anybody up to now.
As the BBC struggled out of the war, the death of John Logie Baird signalled the end of the first era of television. But a remarkable prophecy of television's explosive future went almost unnoticed. Published in a small specialist magazine in October 1945, an article written by Arthur C. Clarke proposed in detail a visionary scheme for a television satellite. It would be 17 years before Telstar opened the new race for television. Next week, the story of live TV, from sports to royal weddings.